Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Eugene Planning Commission meeting for December 14th, 2021. I want to thank everybody for joining us in this remote meeting format that we're using as our community continues to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. This format allows us to meet and take care of our business while keeping members, staff, and the public safe. Today, we will be continuing our deliberations on the draft land use code and the Metro Plan amendments that are required to implement Oregon House Bill 2001. I want to note as we start that anyone who wants to access this meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for the meeting. If you do join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, please note your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. So with that, I'd like to move to agenda item A, deliberations, Middle Housing Code amendments. I'd like to turn it over to Terry Harding and Jeff Gepper to lead us through this discussion and review. Terry.
Chair Beeson, get this all situated. Somebody holler if I'm sharing my notes. All right, good. So welcome, planning commissioners and people watching at home or from somewhere else. We're heading into part 3 of our deliberations for the Middle Housing Code amendments. And this evening, we're going to briefly review the project goals and do a staff introduction. That's my part. Then I will give it over to Jeff, and he'll lead you through deliberations on the topics that we have ahead of us for today. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. I will note that we've been doing an extra half hour during these deliberation meetings. So our meeting is scheduled to go until 8 p.m. and we'll try to take a break around 6:45. So as a reminder, these are the project goals for our Middle Housing Code Amendments project. First, to comply with the House bill, first and foremost. And in so doing, we are aiming to further ongoing work aimed at addressing equity and affordability and enable more production of diverse types of housing across Eugene. This is our latest schedule. It shows that if our local code is not in place by June 30th, 2022, that's at the very end of this chart, the state's model code will apply. And we're in our December deliberations, scheduled to finish in January before sending the Planning Commission's recommendation on to the City Council, who will hold their own public hearing in March. This is a brief review of some of the highlights that came out of the 10 months of public outreach that we did for this project. These themes emerged from outreach done with several different groups and with the general public. The themes include equity and inclusion as a focus while we're making choices throughout the code, encouraging and incentivizing middle housing across the community, near transit routes, encouraging compact development by reducing parking requirements, and pursuing a variety of incentives and programs within and beyond the code as part of our ongoing housing work. We'll talk about that some tonight. So this is a graphic that shows our guide to the adoption process. This is on our website and summarizes all of the work that has culminated and resulted from the 10 months of public outreach and technical analysis. It includes code summary tables that show for a variety of standards what the minimum standard is according to the state's administrative rules in the left-hand column, Then what would be required for that standard in the state's model code in the center column. And then in the right-hand column, what Eugene's recommended standard is. And there's a key here to whether that standard or that recommendation would allow, encourage, or incentivize middle housing. And as a brief reminder of what those terms mean, allow is generally the minimum standard. Encourage does more to remove barriers to middle housing, and incentivize does even more to remove barriers and lower costs. We talked about what we're attempting to do around middle housing affordability last time, and this is kind of a even more summarized version of the slide we talked about last time. So while the city cannot directly require that new middle housing be affordable to people in certain income ranges, there are ways to encourage and incentivize middle housing affordability. First, within the Middle Housing Code amendments, we can allow more housing by allowing smaller lots by right, which is in your current recommendation. We can also allow detached middle housing as well as attached, which increases flexibility. Second, little things in the code help clear the path to more housing, like flexibility in design standards, which we'll be talking about tonight, added lot coverage and building height, and reduced parking requirements. Third, we can incentivize smaller and more attainable middle housing rental units by allowing even smaller lots and no parking required if the units are offered to people with limited incomes. And this is something Jeff will go over in a lot more detail in a little while. Lastly, through the housing implementation pipeline process, the city can offer additional incentives and programs beyond the code, including a density bonus, for example, up to a sixplex, for owners who choose to keep some units affordable, and other things like reducing city fees and property taxes. Next steps in looking at the density bonus option include economic feasibility analysis, which we're asking our consultants at Eco Northwest to do for us, and vetting with developers of affordable and market rate housing. More on that in the new year. Let's see. Well, I included this slide because in one of your last meetings, you selected this option, and so I wanted to have it in the PowerPoint and part of the record for this meeting. I apologize for the graininess of this map, but the Planning Commission voted to forward option 3 for the near transit parking reduction for middle housing. And that includes a quarter-mile buffer around frequent transit routes and a half-mile buffer around existing MX service. Okay, so actually the first item on your list, Jeff, I think is some of the follow-up items, but I don't know. You can switch up the order, and I'll stop sharing so you can share yours.
Great, thanks, Terry. And good evening, commissioners. For anybody that's attending that doesn't know me or watching, I'm Jeff Gepper, Senior Planner, and I've been the lead on the code and kind of taking us through the deliberations process. As Terry just mentioned, I've got our deliberations scheduled for the evening, which includes work, there it goes. We're going to be looking at design, touching base on a few things that were brought up and that we're returning to make sure that we've got providing you with updated information or clarity on a few final key things. First, that's design standards, and this is actually specific. Oh, I see Commissioner Feigl has a question before I get too deep.
Yeah, if you want to review the agenda, that's fine. I just had a question about the paging again. So do you want to finish this piece and then answer the question?
Perfect, that sounds
okay.
Good. So the first thing, design standards, we're looking specifically at those design standards that Commissioner Taylor had brought some recommendations forward for, and we put those into code form. I'm gonna pull an audible since she's not training us quite yet. And move on to alley access lots and working through those, because we also got direction to take a look at alley access lots and what middle housing looks like in those areas. We also have conversions of structures into middle housing, our university neighborhood special standards, special area zones, just an opportunity to deliberate on those again, middle housing land divisions, a brief presentation, and then other code issues, followed up by the Metro Plan Amendment Policy and some affordability strategies. So some of these items will be a little meatier than others. And so with that, Commissioner Fragala, if you wanted to ask your questions on page numbers, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, so I apologize. I'm still a little confused about the document that you sent out. So for example, when I look at conversions of structures into middle housing, I should be able to find that on page 61 and 93, regardless of which version it is. And that is the page number at the top of the document page, right? So like that page number right there.
It should be this page number at the top there.
Okay. All right. I'll keep trying. Thank you.
If that's incorrect,
it looks right for one of the items, but I'll keep checking as I work through things.
okay, I apologize for, and please follow up with me and we can, I'll double check with you and make sure that that's.
Yeah, you're doing great, Jeff. It's me.
All right, so, and I do see that Commissioner Taylor has joined us, so I'm gonna somehow pull back my Audible and we're just gonna start right and go along with the order of operations here. So let's get rolling. So starting with design standards, we're gonna start with looking at Commissioner Taylor's recommendation that we discussed last time and there was general support for, but wanted to really see what that would actually look like in the code. And so what we were talking about were entry orientation standards, and these apply to both triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes. And what Commissioner Taylor brought forward is the removal of a couple of the standards that could be considered arbitrary. And so those are things like the requirement to have a main entrance within 8 feet of the longest street-facing wall of a dwelling unit, or opening onto a porch that's 25 square feet in area, or is facing the street or has a roof. And just to provide some context for what that looks like, here is a figure that demonstrates what the 8-foot standard, for example, looks like. So you've got the longest street-facing wall here, and this requirement requires the main entrance to be within 8 feet. And then you can see the same standard applies to when the door is on an angle. And then you can see here what a porch looks like. It's forcing it to face the street. Also would have that 8-foot setback. So under these amendments, it would essentially just change that main entrance to face the street, be located at a 45-degree angle, or open onto a porch generally without so much specificity. And so with that, I'll open it up for deliberations or questions or comments. And if there are no questions, I'm happy to just take Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I'm realizing, at least to maintain intent, I think that subsection 3, we might want to consider leaving the at least one entrance. That gets a little tricky. I mean, I understand because could this theoretically, let me step that through again. At least one main entrance must meet the standard. Any detached or 50% of the street. So, sorry, you're closer to this. Would subsection 3 mean they could open onto a porch that's actually in the backyard? But I think subsection A wouldn't allow that. Do you see where I'm going with this? Like, did we just open this up so that
I do think you're correct, and that this having it opening onto a porch that doesn't, if the porch doesn't necessarily face the street, then that porch could be located on the side of a structure that faces the side yard, but doesn't necessarily open up to or face the front yard or the front of the property. So if I'm going to use the example here, I think you could take this porch and you can move it actually towards the back here so that the a person could exit out this way and look like that. That's what the code as drafted here would allow.
So I'm not sure that is meeting the intent. I like the entry orientation. I just didn't like, I mean, I think it's consistent with other code standards. I think it creates the active frontage. So I think I'm just going to throw out that I think that the porch, we might want to leave a portion of that detail. And let me just think about it since I just ran in and sat down. But that would be my only concern about that. And I'm sorry, I didn't, that is something I'm not sure I like that flexibility.
Absolutely. And I would just offer that it would be a relatively simple fix to not delete subsection B or incorporate subsection B, which is the have at least one entrance facing the street, which is regarding the entrance to the porch, not necessarily the entrance to the house. We could incorporate that into subsection 3 so that it would at least require one entrance on the porch to open up to be facing the street. And Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I wanted to say briefly, I guess I support maintaining these design standards in here. I think I made some statements last time about the idea of maybe reviewing them. I guess I'd like to ask a very quick question of Jeff. Just kind of confirm, I've got an idea that these are wouldn't be expected to be adding significant time in the permitting process. I mean, I think a lot of what, as I go through the whole thing on middle housing and all of the different things that we're reviewing, part of it is to remove barriers, make it efficient, decrease the amount of money people are spending and so on. So it's kind of the only, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Looking at the way that these standards are being provided, we are creating them in a clear and objective way. That's our, the intent of this, which that in itself is creating a more expedited process from a review and preparation of materials standpoint. Also, if you look into the context of what currently applies, triplexes, quadplexes are multifamily. So they trigger the multifamily standards currently, which is a much more robust set of standards. So in terms of reducing the amount of barriers through the design standards themselves, I mean, you're talking about a pretty significant reduction in that in moving to these standards as they're drafted for the middle housing. So I think overall, looking at the cost of development, you are reducing it if you're looking at the time spent in preparation to meet the design standards, which currently are, as I said, rather intense.
Do you mind if I add to that, just that I think that's if you're looking at it relative to multifamily, and really just to explain where my orientation is, and looking at it as middle housing. So I orient from the perspective of middle housing, and if middle housing really has kind of comparable infilling within that single family realm. So I look at it a little bit different. So yes, Jeff's exactly right. I would like to facilitate I would love to, in certain areas where, like I said, remove some of that, the bit of design standards, because it goes beyond what would be allowed, what would be required for single unit or duplexes. It's still got some, so it's not like we're eliminating them altogether, but some of these other elements, because for instance, if something inside was designed a certain way, it's all connected, and you needed 9 feet instead of 8 feet. Now you're in an adjustment review, or that house needs to be changed. And honestly, with small footprints, those designs get really tight. They're finicky because they're small and efficient. So that's kind of the perspective I'm taking is, yeah, 25 feet, you know, a little arbitrary, 8 feet, a little arbitrary. Have it be clear that, okay, we want an active frontage, and then let the design kind of have an element of flexibility.
So I want to say a couple of other things real quickly too, and of kind of a follow up to what Commissioner Taylor's saying there. I think it's a good idea to have these standards in. I'm definitely in agreement with retaining them, and I'm going to be okay with the. I mean, as we've discussed them, as we've seen the revisions that she's proposing, that all sounds good to me. I think, back to the general a little bit, given what we're doing, allowing as we implement middle housing across the city, given that the state of Oregon is kind of recommending these sorts of design standards, that kind of helps, I think, to allow or provide for some opportunities for kind of compatibility with the new housing, middle housing going into some of the existing residential areas. I think it makes sense for us to do something like this. So I'm in support of it.
Thank you. So if I can, I do plan on taking a straw poll regarding this specific amendment. And so Commissioner Taylor, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, you would support amending 3 to include open up onto a porch facing the street.
Yeah.
That's the way that I'm understanding you. And Commissioner Edwards, I see your hand raised.
Sorry, Jeff, I don't mean to interrupt, but my understanding of the model code having these standards is that a lot of communities have prescriptive, have prescriptive development standards. And correct me if I'm wrong, we do not have design standards for like single family dwellings, correct, Jeff?
Correct.
So our option is we could either just not have, we don't have to have anything, just like we don't with our single family dwellings, or we can incorporate something that was intended to, I think, address communities that do have. So this was like their way of saying, well, we've got lots of design standards for our single family homes, so this should meet all of those. So I just wanted to kind of, the way that I see it is based on the fact that we don't have them for single family dwellings, I wouldn't think that they're necessary, but I get where, I'm comfortable with this. I don't think that this is onerous, and I think that these are pretty easy to comply with, but I just wanted to point that out to make sure people understood that the model code was designed to accommodate the entire state and all of the different municipalities that have different things. And so we just happen to not have a lot of restrictions when it comes to this. And so we're adding something that we don't already have, but I'm okay with the consensus. So like I said, I don't feel like this is super onerous. So Jeff, I'll go ahead and say what you were going to say. So I apologize.
No need to apologize. Commissioner Taylor, you have your hand raised as well.
Sorry, I wanted to go back, but because you're a pro at this, an expert at this code, the only thing I want to double check first, and yes, I agree with you, Commissioner Edwards, that's exactly the context. So we just have something in front of us. Do we believe the scale of a triplex, quadplex is something that this would be potentially important, even though we don't have it for single family, hence not duplexes. And it used to fall in the multifamily standards, right? These units. So that is the question in front of us. And quite frankly, if I would be willing to consider dropping more, but this, it seems like a happy medium to me. My only question for you, Jeff, is my main concern would be, let's say does this code section, so step me back in one of the sections below, this would only pertain if the triplex or fourplex was adjacent to the street. Like if you had 2 of them, it wouldn't force an adjustment review because one was compliant and there was another structure that's, let's say there's a single family already existing and you have it's not a good example. I guess it would always only be one structure. So you see where I'm going. I'm trying to unravel this to make sure we haven't unnecessarily created something that's not clear enough, similar to multifamily. If the structure sits within the setback area or 40 feet within the setback area, that's kind of where I'm going. That isn't here. That scenario couldn't happen, right? Do you understand my question? Sorry.
I'm not sure that I do. If you could potentially elaborate.
Yeah, sure. I'll give the multifamily examples. So in multifamily standards, they have to meet some of these front yard setback type related code sections like entry orientation. If the building's within 40 feet of the front property line, because if they're far enough back, there's other things activating that street potentially, landscaping, etc. So I just want to make sure that if this is a building set far back for whatever reason, that it's not then meeting all these things, because in some ways that doesn't seem so I just want to make sure that we're not setting that up.
There's no distance qualifier here, so this would apply no matter where the structure is located on a lot.
So that was the only thing I would mention, is that in that context, I'd want to make sure that we're clear that this is only required if it's sitting within a certain distance. Because I think about my neighborhood, there are some structures set way back, and quite frankly, it's irrelevant if they have a front entry facing the street or not. They're far back. They've got trees. They've got a nice fence. They've got a garden, and they could be side oriented. So I guess I want to bring that up because yeah.
I guess my only question might be for Lauren, is looking at whether or not that standard, which doesn't exist in the model code, would potentially present an issue with implementing it. And we would run afoul of the requirements of the actual statutes and the model code. So Lauren, if you could potentially help me out. I'm not sure if we can answer that question today, but.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think so. Because these are design standards, we need to, the city's options are to adopt the standards from the model code, adopt something that's less restrictive than the model code, or adopt a standard that's the same as would apply to single family. And we don't have these standards for single family, so we are limited to either model code, which is what we imported into the draft code, or something that's less restrictive than the model code. I think allowing, or removing entry orientation type standards from buildings, excuse me, set back a certain distance from the street frontage would be less restrictive, because there will be buildings that will not be required to comply with those design standards. That said, we want to think about exactly what the proposal is, look at the language, and make sure that we're comfortable that it is in fact less restrictive than the model code. Did that help, Jeff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was imagining that it would technically be less restrictive because less buildings would actually be impacted by this requirement. I think what I'm going to do at this point is, first and foremost, I'm going to take a straw poll on the actual amendment that we see in front of us right now. And then I'm going to ask I'm going to follow that up with if there's support on following up with Commissioner Taylor's recommendation to have staff look into the distance question, and also what that distance might be, because I think that's another question that staff's going to have. So
can you clarify, are we adding back in at least one entrance facing the street in 3?
Yeah, I'll clarify that in just a second. And I just want to remind everybody that these straw polls are just giving staff direction for the final set of code amendments that'll be presented to you, and you'll have an opportunity up until you make your recommendation to flag any issues that you do see. So this is really just providing staff with that direction. Lauren, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. Commissioner Fragala partially asked my question too. I just wanted to be clear about, because there's been some discussion about the changes. It sounds, what I think I heard is that the current subsection B will be removed. The main entrance must be within 8 feet, etc. New subsection B, former subsection C, 3 will remain, but the porch will be required to have at least one entrance facing the street. Is that? So I see Commissioner Franklin nodding, Commissioner Taylor shaking her head. So I just want to clarify that. And then the other piece is that, Jeff, when you and I kind of walked through all those figures that you showed as part of your discussion, we realized that especially if the main entrance requirement, the 8 feet requirement comes out, and especially when the porch requirement was kind of coming out altogether, those figures don't really become a bit unnecessary because the things that they're showing would no longer be requirements. So I think part of the straw poll is also removing the figures. So Commissioner Taylor.
So what I heard Jeff say, which is what is consistent with what I was saying, is a porch that faces the street. So it allows for the entrance to be flexible on, so it could be a side entrance on the porch, but the porch faces the street. So that's what Jeff had said, which that gives that flexibility. And really it's the porch location. So someone clearly sees where the entrance area is, you've got a porch, and it just might be a side door. So that's it, but that's what I would propose.
So I think from there, I think I can probably introduce this in a way that will hopefully be clear to everybody. If anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm happy to do that. So we're looking at the proposed amendment that's on the screen. We're going to take a straw poll for support of that. And the only thing that we're changing is we are removing the 25 square foot requirement. We are also removing the have at least one entrance facing the street for a porch or a roof, but we're adding to number 3, we would say open onto a porch facing the street, so that the one entrance of the porch is going to face the street. Are there any questions about the straw poll that we're about to take? All right, I will open that up for support of this amendment. Raise your hands, please. Perfect, thank you. I see 5. I will get to Commissioner Taylor's other questions shortly, but as Lauren just introduced, also these figures become unnecessary as we've taken out the 2 specifying characteristics that are on these figures. So we have 3 figures that are associated with that. So I would like to introduce a second straw poll that just supports removing these redundant figures at this point if they're deemed to be unnecessary. Support for that? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Perfect, thank you. And then lastly, I want to open it up for discussion on Commissioner Taylor's comments on whether or not we should be looking into having these standards for main entrances only apply a certain distance. So in this example, let's say if a structure is more than 30 feet from the front property line, that these entry orientation standards wouldn't apply. And so I'll open that up for comments and discussion. Commissioner Fragala.
So I feel like we're talking about relatively small lots, and we've also been discussing 75% coverage, and I'm wondering how frequently we would have dwelling units that were sitting that far back. So that's my first question. And then my second question, which I felt like I heard Commissioner Taylor asking, was if we're talking about triplexes and quads that could potentially be detached, what if one of the dwelling units is not on the street? Does it still need to face, does the entrance still need to face the street? So for example, in this picture, if you had a dwelling unit, if you had that long skinny lot that we're going to talk about, and you had a dwelling unit that was behind this one, would that automatically mean that the entrance needs to face the street?
That's a great question. And so we would actually start by going to the, well, you kind of think of it as like the applicability section for the entry orientation standards. So it says at least one main entrance for each triplex or fourplex structure must meet the standards in some paragraph C.
Okay, that clarifies it.
And so, yeah, so if it's kind of behind it or any situation like that, and this should say subparagraph B, just to be clear, but that's one of those tiny corrections that we're gonna have to make later. Would be considered Scribner's at this point, but yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. Commissioner Taylor, I see your hand is up.
That's exactly, Commissioner Fragala, that's actually exactly where my question lies. So that exact same example can go with a stagger effect. So if you took your same example, and let's say you had an existing lot that was larger, you didn't want to subdivide it, you have a single family house, but now you've added this triplex. It's sitting behind it, but it still has street frontage because a good portion of the building is sitting facing the street. That's where in multifamily that building would not have to comply because if it's sitting behind the setback. So I think there might be circumstances that actually this could potentially apply and we didn't intend it to. And that's really what I'm trying to get at is your question also. Have we covered ourselves? So we haven't created a situation where it's unnecessarily creating these front entry, these orientations when actually it's not super relevant because the building in front more or less is. So that's where it comes from. So I think, Jeff, you have context and that's, yeah.
So is there, Commissioner Beeson?
I just wanted to say, as I understand the proposal and am listening to the discussion, I agree with it. I think it's a good idea. And I think if you were between now and the next meeting, given that we're taking straw polls and so on, as you talked about, if you were to write this up and give us all a chance to kind of reflect on it, I mean, I'm ready to support it right now, but I think we'd be looking to have a more formal support later. So I think it's a good idea.
And to be clear, you're in support of Commissioner Taylor's recommendation to look into a distance applicability standard that would say the standard only applies within a certain distance of the front yard?
I am, and I was hearing in excess of 30 feet.
That was just a number that I threw out, so it's totally.
Oh, so I guess the concept of it is what I'm agreeing with, and that I guess is even more reason to maybe write it down in some specificity so we can have a chance to think it through.
Commissioner Taylor.
That and also addressing what Commissioner Fragala and that you identified, just if there's a building in front of it, it doesn't have to.
And so the applicability section here does mention that if a structure is separated from the street facing facade by more than 50%, this standard doesn't apply either. So it's only in those situations when a structure, if you're looking from the street facade towards the yard, that you can see more than 50% of that facade, then the entryway standard would apply. So in Commissioner Fragala's example of a skinny long lot, it's unlikely that you'd have 50% of the facade showing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
With a wider example, you would likely end up with a situation where the standard would apply to that other structure.
Yeah, it makes sense for me just from an equitable standpoint in terms of, once again, that reference of middle housing, single family and kind of infill is if we have a distance from the property line, we're also allowing more flexibility because with 50%, you could have staggered buildings and they're pretty far away, yet they're still facing the street. It becomes less important that they are. So I think that addition of, as long as they're within a setback, it seems like a reasonable approach. And like I said, it's consistent with multifamily, actually. Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, with that, I will take a straw poll for support of staff bringing back language that reflects Commissioner Taylor's recommendation to provide a distance qualification for when these standards for entryway orientation do apply. Is there support for that from the commission? I see 5 hands. We will bring that back to you. All right, I don't think I did want to, those were my last, that was the only topic that we were asked to bring back regarding design standards. I don't want to just close that door. So if anybody wants to discuss any other design standards that potentially staff didn't bring to the table today that we didn't potentially discuss enough last week, I'm happy to open that up now before we move on to alley access lots and special neighborhood standards. Commissioner Taylor.
You know, I think, Jeff, and once again, I'm going to rely on you. You also have some townhouse. There wasn't this also a similar code?
Yeah, when I introduced this at the beginning, I did reference that this was applying to triplexes, fourplexes. And
okay, great, perfect, thank you. And the other, I'm not sure if this is the time, they are in the design standards, is the number of parking spaces that you have to have separation in cottage clusters. Did you already talk about that?
I have not talked about that, but we are in discussions around design standards. So I'd be happy to share that piece of code for everybody's benefit. You're talking about the cottage cluster parking requirement?
Yeah.
Yeah, give me one moment, and I apologize, everybody, close your eyes while I find this. Okay, so I believe Commissioner Taylor, you were looking to discuss, I think it was the number of, right here. Yeah, these two sections, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to introduce your thoughts here?
Yeah, I once again, I go to, you know, I don't need to keep saying it, but that continuity of kind of looking at that, what I'll call is equity, just consistency, is that right now we have contiguous spaces of 10. So you have a break of 10 spaces with a landscape island. For interior islands, like for commercial, it's only triggered when you have 50 or more spaces, but it is something familiar. It's used not directly in this context, but I would, especially if you're trying to get something dense, I personally am more comfortable with 10. I think that if parking wants to be required, you've got these small lots. It just allows more flexibility to be able to provide the parking. You've got an open space, you've got, you know, your courtyard. So I think you also are going to meet landscape standards in terms of some of the other elements that are in here. I shouldn't say landscape requirements because they're not going to landscape standards per se, but so anyways, that's you can ask me questions, but that's kind of where the frame, I always go to, what do we use currently? Why is this here? I get it because of the number of units, but personally, I would like to see that more flexible.
And I'll take a quick opportunity just for everybody's watching for their benefit. If you haven't been in this process, what we're talking about is parking for cottage clusters. Currently, the design of parking lots only allows for, if you have 16 or fewer cottages, you only get 5 contiguous spaces, and they then have to either be in a separate parking section or have to be separated by a landscape island. And then for cottage clusters of 16 or more, it's 8 contiguous spaces. And so what Commissioner Taylor, if I'm understanding you correctly, it would be regardless of the number of cottages, we'd be looking at 10 contiguous spaces would be allowed. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so I'll open it up for anybody else's, any other comments or deliberations? Seeing none, yeah, Commissioner Edwards.
All right, finding my buttons here. Are there any, I mean, are the standards that Commissioner Taylor is referencing, the 10, is that consistent across the board? Are there any other variations of standards elsewhere? I'm just wondering if there's like 5 for such and such, and does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
Because I see she's looking for consistency. I totally support that. I think that makes sense, but I'm just wondering if we have a variety of parking requirements for different things that we're either proposing or that exist in our code right now.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And off the top of my head, I do not know the answer for the regularity of the number 10. I would be happy during our break to look that up really quickly, because it's a pretty quick thing for me to check, and I can bring that back to commissioners following our break in about a half hour that we'll take. So if that's fine, we could table this conversation until that time, and I can provide a little more context. Commissioner Taylor.
So I guess I'll go to, where I'm drawing from is from the parking. So it's from the development standards that are applicable ubiquitously. I'll use that word. So it's more of the general development standards. The other sections that you'd be talking about are something like, I'm thinking, I don't know, Jeff check Walnut Mixed Use Station. That's a really different code. It's a form-based code. What I don't want to do is create special areas for middle housing, because essentially what at least consistent with what we've heard from the public, is they want flexibility. So if we're going to be applying a whole nother set, to me, that I'm going to defer. So know that where my orientation is going to be is consistent with that more broader, higher number of feedback we've gotten from the public about flexibility. So just wanted to let you know kind of where I'm orienting. I think there are other sections in the code, but once again, those are in special development standards, and I don't want this to be, where possible, be special. I'd like for it to have the flexibility going back to single family, for instance. Anyways, so there, yeah.
All right, so if there are no other questions, I'll be happy to table this and take the opportunity to look that information up during our break. And I can bring that back to you for just a quick straw poll following that. What the recommendation would be changing it for, regardless of the number of cottages, allowing 10 contiguous spaces of parking to occur without landscape islands. And so I'll hold off on that for now. And Commissioner Taylor, did you have any, or did any commissioners have any other design standards that they wanted to discuss today before we move on? All right, seeing none, I'm going to move on to alley access lots. So I want to start this conversation with a brief introduction of kind of where we're at. So looking at alley access lot standards versus alley access lot creation. Alley access lot creation is extremely limited in Eugene. There's only a one or more of the special area zones that actually allows for alley access lot creation, and there's a lot of standards that apply to that. That said, there are approximately 40 or so alley access lots that exist already in Eugene, and so those alley access lot standards apply to those lots. And so when staff was looking into this, we kind of went on the deep dive through the process, and we really found that while the alley access lot standards are something that we feel we can address through either providing exemptions for middle housing or not having those standards apply to middle housing, we think that the alley access lot, the creation of alley access lots would be better held within a separate process that takes into account kind of the nuances that exist within creating alley access lots. And a lot of that comes from, we just went through a similar process related to this in 2014, and allowance of alley access lots wasn't successful for a number of reasons. It's fairly complex. There's a lot of lot creation standards that we've had to develop in order to create that. So that, after staff review, that's kind of where we landed. Are there any questions? Because otherwise I will go into the alley access lot standards and what staff's proposal is to have those for middle housing on alley access lots. All right, so alley access lot standards, there are quite a few. I've listed them out here, and I'm going to kind of go through these one by one. Staff, basically, we looked at each standard and using your guidance on other standards to essentially apply middle housing rules the same across the city on all lots. That's kind of the tack we took in approaching this, with the exception of one or two where we felt it was probably necessary that those standards remain. So, for example, building size on alley access lots is limited to a certain size. So rather than letting lot coverage control, they actually had size limitations. You can see that we had previously, in the red text, we just reduced or allowed for larger lot sizes to allow essentially for duplexes and things to actually be feasible on a lot. Here, under this new concept of accepting middle housing, we just are simply stating that this standard does not apply to middle housing. And so this is another instance where, as I go through these, I'm going to take a straw poll on each slide. So the straw poll will be whether you are in favor of the highlighted text, which is staff's recommendation under the for accepting or exempting middle housing from the alley access lot standards. And so that's building size. So we wouldn't regulate middle housing by building size. The second one is lot coverage. And here we feel that lot coverage should still apply. But the lot coverage on alley access lots includes all roofed areas, which is different because typically we don't consider roof eaves. And so for consistency's sake, staff recommends that lot coverage is just the same across the board. So we recommended removing that section, and so lot coverage would apply, and that would be kind of what controls the bulk of structure of middle housing on alley access lots. And so with that, I'll open it up for questions, and if there's no questions, I'll move on to the straw poll. Seeing no question, Commissioner Fragler.
So number 3, it would not apply to middle housing. So all of that language would simply not apply to middle housing.
Correct. Yeah. So there would be no control over the actual square footage of a structure. Rather, it would be controlled by the percentage of a lot that you can cover with a building.
Similar to other middle housing types.
Correct. Yeah. So we'd be treating it the same way as our other lots around town. Any other questions? With that, I'll take a straw poll for supporting incorporating this into the draft code amendments. Raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. We will move on to the next one, which is building height and interior setbacks. And here, interior yard setbacks shall be at least 5 feet. So that's standard across the board. For other zones, barring the front yard setback on normal lots is 10 feet. The interior yard setback is 5 feet. And for structures on alley access lots, they've traditionally been controlled through a sloped setback and pretty limited height changes. So we'd be looking, so essentially what would happen is if you could only go a certain height, then you'd have to slope inward, and you were capped at about 18 feet. That's where it was previously. You see the red text here. Those are our changes in version 2 of the draft code. So just the highlight portions are what we're focusing on today. But so what we're looking at is for setbacks, it would be 5 feet for middle housing, just like it is in other areas. And then the maximum building height for middle housing would be 35 feet, the same as it is on other lots. And so the other thing is that the allowances for setback intrusions provided at 9.6745. So this is allowing things like balconies and bay windows and other things to protrude within to the setbacks. Here, they add some other restrictions to that, and we also just said that those restrictions do not apply to middle housing. They can basically take advantage of those setback intrusions that are allowed everywhere else. And so with that, I'll open it up for any questions regarding setbacks, building height, and setback intrusions. Commissioner Taylor.
I just want to make sure, I'm not sure if this is, because the way I first understood it is the standard in subsection B is that middle housing doesn't get to take advantage of setback intrusions, which actually caused me, I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't think that's consistent with the code in kind of that flexibility piece. But that's what you're saying isn't happening. It's the additional. So I'm not sure that's clear here.
Okay, that's a fair comment. I will talk to Lauren about making sure that language is correct, but just to ensure, just to be very clear, what staff's intended change here for subsection B is to allow middle housing to take advantage of the setback intrusions provided at 9.6745. And so really we're trying to not have the additional limitations that are qualified here apply to middle housing. And so does that make sense, Commissioner Taylor?
Yeah, I think it's great. I totally
Okay.
get what you're saying. I just want to make sure that maybe Lauren takes a look at it, make sure it's really clear so you're not ending up in some kind of.
I think that's an absolute valid point. And so with that knowledge, I'll ask for a straw poll for having the interior yard setback of 5 feet for middle housing on alley access lots, the building height be 35 feet. And to be very clear, having staff make sure that the language in subsection B allows middle housing to take advantage of the setback intrusions at 9.6745 sub 3. Is there support for that? Thank you. This next one is about window dormers and balconies. So this is essentially the intent of this was to limit or protect privacy on lots that are properties that might be next to alley access lots that exist. So it really limits where windows can be in relation to property lines, in relation to other structures. And it limits on how big and bulky dormers can be, because under the previous provisions, dormers were the only way to get a true second story when you have a building height of 18 feet. So essentially what we've said is just that the window dormers and balconies section would not apply to middle housing. That the normal rules would apply. Are there any questions regarding that? Commissioner Fragler.
And just to clarify, none of these requirements apply to single family homes?
These requirements do apply and would apply to single family homes.
On an alley access lot?
On an alley access lot only.
But they would not apply to middle housing on an alley access lot?
That's correct. Any other follow-up questions? Otherwise, is there support for exempting middle housing from the windows, dormers, and balconies provisions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to cover a couple here. On alley access lots, dwellings are limited to 3 bedrooms. The primary entrance has to be covered and has to have a minimum depth of no less than 3 feet. And then pedestrian access, the dwellings must be served by a 3-foot wide pedestrian walkway that provides that to the street essentially. So what we're looking at is essentially not having any of these standards apply, because in the event that you have the standards for triplexes and fourplexes and stuff would apply anyways. So you're going to trigger those entryway orientation, those other design standards for those types of middle housing. And so here, this is just exempting middle housing from the bedroom standard, the primary entrance standard, and pedestrian access. And so I'll open that one up for questions, because there's a number on the page here. Commissioner Isaacson. All right, well, I can't hear you, you're unmuted, but.
I was moving my cat, sorry.
Oh. Did you have a comment or question? Okay, good. All right, well, with that, I'll ask if there's support for exempting middle housing using the yellow text here on the screen. Okay. Parking spaces, this is actually one where we already, in order to comply with the statutes, we had already exempted middle housing. So there's not really anything else to do here based on how we have already had the recommended changes. So if there's any questions, otherwise I'll just move on. Seeing no questions, I'll move on. Okay, so this is probably the biggest one that we'll see for alley access lots, which is regarding parking and driveway standards. So basically, it only allows one covered or enclosed parking space per dwelling. It governs the size of a garage structure. It governs the setbacks for garages, explicitly requiring it to be further back if it's not right up against the front setback. Governs the width of the driveway, limiting it to 12 feet. It governs the size of parking spaces, be that one parking space, two parking spaces, or tandem parking spaces. And that's really, it was looking at limiting the amount of cars on a lot as well as the bulk and scale of paved areas. Only one parking space parallel to the alley shall be allowed. So that's in the instance where you'd actually you'd have a parallel parking spot on your lot that pulls right off of the alley. It limits the overall total vehicle use area to 400 feet, and no parking shall occur outside of the vehicle use area. So this is really controlling where and how vehicles can exist on a lot. And so with just a blanket exception at the bottom, we said that these do not apply to middle housing development. So I'll open that one up for questions as one of the bulkier sections. Commissioner Fragala. Oh, Terry, I also see your hand up. I'll get to you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that for all of these where we're recommending exempting middle housing altogether, we're still recommending the red text edits for other code clarification reasons. Correct. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Yep.
And also just to clarify, even though we're exempting middle housing from the text that is demonstrated here, there are still requirements within the middle housing draft code that we're proposing adopting that apply to parking, that will be applied to middle housing. It's not like they completely go unregulated, correct?
Correct, yeah. So the special development standards will apply to middle housing that apply elsewhere. Any other follow-up questions on this section? That'll take us a poll for support of exempting middle housing from the parking and driveway standards. Seen here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're getting pretty close. This is actually the instance in which it's the only code provision that we did not recommend an exception for. We're looking at the distance from street/fire safety. And so this essentially says that if you are more than 150 feet, so if you're, to think about it simply, if you're down an alley further than 150 feet, you would be required to have sprinklers in accordance with the fire code for your structure. And really that's associated with the fact that you, on certain alleys, a fire truck may not be able to access your lot, and therefore you need additional fire suppression. We have this same standard for single family homes that are located on a panhandle lot or a flag lot where the house is going to be too far back for a fire truck to ever get there. The fire sprinklers would be applied. So we feel like this is pretty justified, ensuring kind of a life and safety question to have this standard still apply to middle housing. And it does apply to single family homes too. So the next one is trash and recycling. So consistent with how we've dealt with trash and recycling elsewhere for middle housing, we had that not apply because it does require screening with a fence. And then the last one is accessory buildings. So it limits the size of accessory buildings on a lot. And I should say that the reference down here says this standard does not apply to middle housing. But what it should say, for clarity for everybody, this is what staff would have to have us say to make sure that it's accurate, is it would say this standard does not apply to accessory buildings that are accessory to middle housing. Because obviously an accessory building isn't middle housing, and we'd have to be very clear about that. So with that slight amendment to that bottom section, making sure that it's very clear on how that's going to apply, are there any questions regarding these three sections? I'll take a straw poll for support. All right, so I think we are at the last one, because this is kind of we're starting to blend our topics today. So here we're talking about standards for alley access lots that are in the Amazon neighbor, Fairmont neighbor, and South University neighborhood association areas. So this is those we collectively refer to those as the university area neighborhoods. And so these are special standards that that's governing building size, the same as our very first one that we talked about. We do not want the building size standard, or we do not recommend that the building size standard apply to middle housing. And we still recommend you see significant changes to the red text here. And we do feel that these changes make it more clear on what's being included in building size. So we do still recommend that change, but making sure that this standard does not apply to middle housing. And so is there general questions regarding this one? And then we're going to dive into the university area neighborhoods next. And if not, is there support for not having the building size apply? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so I think I made it. I'll come back to conversion of structures. I'm going to touch base on the university special neighborhood standards. And these are pretty short, so I'm going to get through these and then we'll take a break right after this section. So as I mentioned, these are 3 neighborhoods. It's Amazon, Fairmont, and South University, where special standards apply. Staff recognize that while they're not their own special area zone, they do have special standards, and based on the Planning Commission's interest in treating all middle housing equally across Eugene, regardless of what their zone is, we wanted to make sure that that was true for the university area neighborhoods as well. And so this is what that would look like if we go down that path. And there aren't actually that many standards. Commissioner Fragala.
And so I recall Alyssa mentioning something at our last meeting when we discussed this that had something to do with these standards were actually meant to be temporary based on maybe a neighborhood plan. And I was wondering if somebody could provide more clarification on that.
Yeah, I can speak generally, and I think Terry probably can give a lot more detail, but they are referred to as the interim measures or interim protection measures, which was essentially a set of code amendments that were put in place until such a time that the university area neighborhoods would have their own refinement plan that they could then base code changes off of to create longer term protection measures. And Terry, I'm happy to let you speak a little bit more on that if you want to.
Yeah, I think I would just add that they were adopted obviously prior to House Bill 2001. And so it's consistent what we're recommending in this process. Doesn't undo standards that are in place for single dwellings. And the university neighborhoods are still on the work plan for an area plan in the future. And it will need to comply with House Bill 2001 and any other standards that are in place at the time.
Thank you for that clarification.
All right, so looking at the first standard, this is one regarding driveways and parking areas. And this is one of those instances in which you have already, in order to comply with this, the state law, addressed this one. So I'm gonna just move right along. So this is one where accessory buildings, this is where I got the text right here. It says accessory buildings that are accessory to middle housing. So accessory buildings in the university area neighborhoods are much more controlled in terms of size, scale, bulk, number of plumbing fixtures. There's a lot of standards that apply to these accessory buildings. And so if we're going to treat them like everybody else, we would just have the normal accessory building standards apply, which you see at the bottom there, it says subsection A would apply. And those are the standards that apply to all accessory buildings elsewhere throughout R1. And so with that, I'm happy to, if commissioners are interested, diving into what those standards actually look like, or we can ask questions about the proposal here. So I'll open it up. Commissioner Fagala.
So we're basically saying that we're going to apply the same standards to middle housing in these neighborhoods that we're applying to all other middle housing throughout the city, in all neighborhoods.
Correct. All right, with that, I'll take a straw poll for support of treating accessory buildings and middle housing the same as elsewhere. 5 hands. This next one is a specific bedroom count. So similar to alley access lots, lots within the university area neighborhoods, they do have limited bedroom totals, and then a lot of caveats. If you're going to above and beyond that, there's some recording requirements and things like that. So really, we're looking at a maximum bedroom limitation of 3. And so here, this would once again just provide a clear exception to the standard, saying that it does not apply to middle housing. So are there any questions about the maximum bedroom limitation? If not, I'll ask for Commissioner Edwards.
I don't know that it's a question so much as it's just an observation. I think with middle housing, I don't think we would expect to see 5-bedroom, you know, cottages. So, I mean, I'm just kind of, I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, but anyhow, I don't know that it's even necessary, just because these dwellings are intended to be smaller for a reason, because they're, you know, so I don't know. I guess they just don't. I mean, I understand that this area is there's a lot of student housing, things like that. So I just want to make sure that, you know, the concerns that we hear about certain areas of the community that tend to have a lot of, you know, students living in them. This is kind of one of those situations where, to me, it just seems like unnecessary to limit number of bedrooms on units that are already going to be much smaller. So I guess that's just my sort of 2 cents.
Thank you, Commissioner Edwards. Are there any other comments or questions, deliberations? Otherwise, I will ask for a poll of support for the changes to exempt middle housing from the bedroom limitations in the university area neighborhoods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and this, I believe, is the last one. So this is flag lots. So currently, flag lots are prohibited outright in these university area neighborhoods. You're not allowed to create a new flag lot. What staff has proposed here is that you can see sub D here, that's already in our proposal. That's lowering the lot size for flag lots that are going to be developed with middle housing. That would then, you know, that rule would then apply, and you would, you know, with the exception of flag lots created for the purpose of siting middle housing. So you'd be allowed to create flag lots in the university area neighborhoods, and they would also be subject to the square footage reduction you see in subsection D. And so are there any questions about the creation of flag lots in the university area neighborhoods? That'll take a poll for support. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. And so with that, it's right on time actually with Terry's plan for 6:45 break. So we'll take Chair Beeson, do you want a 5 or a 10-minute break here?
Commissioner Taylor's got her hand up.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry, Jeff. I missed something that had to do with the parking for cottage clusters. So I know you were going to return to answer Commissioner Edwards' question. So can we revisit that? I'm sorry. There's another element to parking that's similar to what we just talked about in terms of, anyways. So I just want to revisit that. The other thing I wanted to just confirm, just because I think you might have talked about at the beginning, is I know I gave kind of a comprehensive kind of evaluation based on public testimony, also a copy to you. So I'm only bringing up very explicit things. So what is the process? So after we do this, we'll get kind of a final edition, right? The final draft to kind of have a motion, and then we can kind of look through to see if there are any kind of straggling pieces we want to bring up. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So for our January 11th deliberations date, we will be presenting you with an updated, so we're now in version 2, right? So we'll then present you with a version 3 with, highlighting any additional changes that have been made, so that you'll have an opportunity to really see what has changed between, version 2 and version 3. And so you'll have a chance at that time to bring up any final items that you want to continue to follow up on. And
thank you. And sorry if you had to repeat that. Thank you.
No, not at all. It's a good reminder for everybody kind of where we are in the process. And lastly, when we do return, I will be going back to the parking requirements just to provide a little bit of clarity on the number of parking spaces that are allowed typically based on our parking standards. And with that, Chair Beeson, would you like to take a 5 or a 10-minute break?
I would suggest 5. I think that worked pretty well last week, and why don't we do 5?
Great. So
I'm seeing some support out there, so okay.
So I see it's 6:47 right now, so we'll be returning at about 6:52. I'm going to be sharing my screen again, and we are looking this time. We're going to go back to the parking standards. And so I'm not actually going to share my screen just yet because this really doesn't require a screen to be shared. But we're looking at the discussion around Commissioner Taylor's recommendation that the parking be allowed to have 10 contiguous spaces in a row before there's a planting island or a gap between the parking areas that's landscaped in some way. And embarrassingly enough, in the 7 minutes that I took while I was gone, I wasn't able to locate that direct standard. So I'd be happy to bring this conversation back at our next deliberation where I can answer with 100% certainty what the answer is. So unless the commission objects, I can bring that at our January 11th conversation. It sounds like there was general support for it. So I'll draft that language and let you decide on that at that time. Is there any comments, questions, or objections to that, Commissioner Taylor? You're muted.
Do you want me to bring up the one other thing here or wait till we come back?
No, please. Yeah, please do. What was the other one? Remind me.
It's right below it. So that was subsection 1A and B. This is subsection 2A. It's the off-street parking areas with 5 or more spaces shall not be located within 20 feet from any property line that abuts a street. I just think this prevents some design creativity, which already happens in terms of what happens if you've got a unit and parking's on the side of the unit. I'm not sure, because 20 feet, if you've got a setback, I don't know. I would either eliminate them. So I guess I want a little bit more context from staff. And I know cottage clusters. I know when I met with you and Lauren, there were a lot of restrictions, and I had quite a few comments in this section. And I know it's one of the more heavily regulated areas in terms of how the legislature adopted kind of House Bill 2001. So just curious about the context. I guess I would like more flexibility at least, or even removal, because we already have there's a bunch of other requirements. So I'm not sure what it's trying to prevent, and is it unnecessarily too restrictive?
Thanks, Commissioner Taylor. Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. And so we are, so just for context, this is really looking to eliminate the possibility of a parking area being or occupying a large part of the frontage abutting a street. And so from what I remember during the rulemaking process, when they were going through the development of the model code, was that they were trying to mitigate the potential impact of having a large parking area occupy a streetscape and create a streetscape environment that has mostly parking spaces adjacent to it. And so they required that to be set back with the assumption that that space will either be filled by a dwelling of some kind or landscaping or other community feature. So I think the intent was just to not create a situation of a lot of parking right along the street. So I think that's about all the context that I can provide. If there's any additional context that Lauren wants to add, but that's what I know and what I recall from the rulemaking.
I guess I would ask, I mean, it goes back to, I think Commissioner Fragola might have asked this, that in reality, if you look at all the other code requirements and a lot of the restrictions in terms of lot size, et cetera, the likelihood of there being a big parking lot in front of Cottage Cluster, really from a design perspective, really isn't going to happen. So I think this is unnecessary and also sits in the side of being unnecessarily inflexible. So that's why it's like, I'm not sure it's needed, quite frankly, but I'd have to look at it closer. So maybe I can look at it closer in the context. At the time, I had looked at it really close. But I do have a concern about this because I think it unnecessarily kind of regulates.
So Is there any other questions from any other commissioners? Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I guess just in support of that and along the lines we were talking about a ways back. I think, I'm on board with the idea of having some of these design standards in there, given that we're allowing middle housing now across the city within the residential areas. But given that, also I'm trying to stay to one of our basic goals of removing barriers, trying to create opportunity for more affordable housing and all of those things, anywhere. And I guess also being sure that we're staying consistent with whatever the law requires us to do. Wherever in here there is some detailed piece that Commissioner Taylor or others think might drop out, what we might be able to take out, I'd be in support of that, where we can kind of refine this or streamline it and still accomplish our purpose.
Commissioner Fragala. I believe you're muted still.
Thank you. I guess I'm understanding that since we're going to look at the other parking piece in our next meeting, that perhaps you can bring both these back to us so we can move on to the rest of tonight's agenda.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that. If there's support from the rest of the commission, we can table these two conversations on the cottage cluster parking standards until January 11th. Staff can bring a little more information on what that draft code change would look like. Commissioner Taylor.
Jeff, I think that's a great idea. That image you just put up, that's a great one for our conversation as we continue it. It's actually exactly what I was talking about.
All right, and are there any other comments or questions on the cottage cluster parking? Otherwise, I will re-engage us back into our deliberation topics. So our next topic is regarding the conversion of structures into middle housing. And so staff wanted to bring this to the table. My apologies, I'm trying to get to a full screen. There it goes. This is specifically regarding the way that is currently written is that the standards for middle housing, so middle housing development standards, so those things that apply to a triplex, fourplex, townhome, or cottage cluster, they don't apply when you are converting either through an addition or whatever, an existing single unit dwelling. So if you convert a house into a triplex or fourplex or duplex or whatever, none of those development standards apply. Additionally, the same exact one exists for parking. So you don't trigger any need for additional parking if you're converting a single unit dwelling into some form of middle housing. That said, it came to staff's attention through, I think, some of the public testimony, as well as just our own reading of the code. And we questioned whether or not, if somebody has an existing duplex and they want to convert that structure into a triplex, or they have an old church or a bed and breakfast that exists currently, and they want to convert it into some form of middle housing, should we extend this conversion exemption to those other types of structures and those other types of uses on a property? And what we're looking for today is really, because we do not have language drafted to reflect this change, we want to know if there's actual interest in this. And so it's really the question of, should the development standards and the parking requirements apply when you're looking to convert an existing duplex or triplex into a larger scale middle housing, or if you're looking to convert an old church or B&Bs that exist? This can apply to a lot of other things, but really looking for the commission's direction. And if there's interest in actually expanding this, and if it's not, is it a bad thing to apply the design standards in those situations? So I'll open it up. Commissioner Edwards.
So in thinking about this, I think in some circumstances, it would be hard to apply design standards if there weren't some to the structure that was there, that they're renovating into a middle housing unit or whatnot. So I'm thinking about that component. And then the other thing I'm thinking is whatever standards that they built the structure under, they now have a structure that exists. I guess I'm just trying to think about the outcomes that we're looking for. And I think it begs the question, going back to the standards that we straw polled and we supported, if a structure can't meet those standards, I guess I would have concerns over that, because if they didn't have standards at the get-go when they built their single family home or whatever it was, and they didn't have to follow standards, and now we are imposing middle housing development standards, I feel like that might make it difficult for those to comply with. I also don't know, forgive me, I don't actually know what constitutes as a conversion, or what is a flat out, we just leveled the structure and left the foundation. I don't know enough. What is it? What is a renovation and what is an actual complete rebuild of something? Is it like the one wall remodel or whatnot? So I guess maybe Jeff, you maybe shed some light on what constitutes as a redevelopment versus a complete rebuild.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to provide a little context on that, and also a little context even beyond that. So so the way that this is written, it's conversion of a structure. So, and you can do additions, you can do alterations, it's whatever that conversion requires. So I think that leaves it open to the situation where you could have an existing structure significantly altered in order to convert it into the middle housing. One thing I do want to call attention to is the fact that because the Planning Commission's current recommendation does allow for detached units of middle housing to be applied, in the event that you wanted to locate, say you have an existing duplex on a lot or triplex on a lot or something, and you want to add another unit, adding that other unit, if you do it as a detached unit, you would not trigger the design standards for the existing structure. Those design standards would only apply to that new structure. So this is the conversion question that we're bringing to you today is a very specific scenario for that will apply in very limited circumstances as we see it. But given some of the testimony and just asking the questions ourselves, that's what we brought it forward today. Commissioner Taylor, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Thanks for noting this. I do support this, and we heard testimony from many people talking about just this, is that really this is encouraging and allowing us to increase housing in situations where you have a conversion. If the requirements had to be met, it could prevent that housing from being expanded or placed as a use within that existing structure. So I'm supportive of this.
Chair Beeson.
I'm supportive for the same reasons. I think our consistent theme all the way through this is we should be doing whatever we can to encourage development of the middle housing across the residential areas, and where we have these occasions of these conversions. And I was reading the draft code language that the existing unit was not being altered, or existing structure. So I was kind of thinking about the detached duplex or triplex at that time. But in any event, I assume there's building code that applies in all these cases. But anyway, I would like to have staff bring back more detail on it, and I'd like to see us pursue it and allow it.
Thank you. Commissioner Fragala.
Yeah, I appreciate staff bringing this back as well, based on what we've heard from the public in terms of providing additional opportunities for housing. I guess my question is, I mean, again, very few situations there, but I can imagine some of these structures potentially being quite large. At what point does it trigger the multifamily housing? Is there a certain number of dwelling units that then triggers the multifamily housing code?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you have 5 or more dwellings on the lot and it's not a cottage cluster, then you're going to be triggering the multifamily standard. So anything greater than a fourplex would trigger that. And obviously, if you're converting, it'd be a unique scenario where you'd be able to create a cottage cluster, but that it's kind of its own. 5 units or more on a lot.
Great, thank you.
Any other follow-up questions? Then I'll take a quick straw poll to support staff drafting language that would incorporate some version of this in order to let the Planning Commission consider it further at the next set of deliberations. Great, that's 5 votes, and I will move on. And we already talked about the university area standards. I'll cruise through that. So we have received pretty clear guidance from the Planning Commission previously on special area zones and the way that we are treating them, which is essentially not applying any of the standards from the special area zones. Instead, for middle housing, these standards that apply in the base zone will operate in the special area zones, creating that equitable, or creating the same rules for middle housing citywide in residential areas. Wanted to take the time today to provide that opportunity for planning commissioners to ask any questions, deliberate, or discuss how we're looking at middle housing and special area zones. Sounds like pretty silent and generally no further questions. Commissioner Edwards?
No questions, no changes for me. I think that I'm really supportive of treating them the same across the board throughout the community.
Great. Well, with that, there's no need to take a poll or anything on this one, so we can just move on to the next deliberation topic. It was just really an opportunity to give anybody a chance to further discuss or deliberate on that one. So next, I'm going to discuss middle housing land divisions. This is something you received a presentation on it in August, and then it was included in some of the material and all the materials as part of our draft land use code, but you haven't seen it. At least staff hasn't provided context on it in a little bit. So I wanted to really quick touch base on what middle housing land divisions are, how they operate, and what the code kind of does to allow these things. And then I'll open it up for questions and comments on the middle housing land division.
Jeff.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Am I the only one that you're coming in and out? Am I the only one that's happening?
I'm not noticing that.
Okay.
I'm not
So it
noticing.
must be me. Okay.
All right, I will continue. Commissioner Taylor, let me know if you continue to have connectivity issues at all. So looking at middle housing land divisions, there's a lot of components to them. So before I dive into this detailed list that I've got here, I'm going to talk about them a little more generally with my favorite PowerPoint example. So here we've got a street down at the bottom. You've got an existing lot, and this lot, let's just say for purposes of this, it's big enough to hold a triplex. And so somebody comes in and they build a triplex on the lot, and that's great. And then they say, oh, well, I want to sell off each one of these units. And this previously was only accessible through condominiumizing, which is a pretty expensive process to go through. And so the state passed Senate Bill 458, which allowed the creation of middle housing lots. And so the way that I like to look at this is you have your parent lot, which you see in the black here. That's your big lot. That's the lot that has to meet lot standards. It has to meet frontage, width, area, all those other requirements it has to meet. And then it allows you to essentially draw boxes, whatever size you want, for sale purposes. There's some rules around that, but it allows you to draw these orange lines. So in this case, I basically said, here you've got middle housing lot or a child lot, sometimes what we refer to them as, for this triplex unit, you've got a middle housing lot here, and then the owner happened to live in the back, so they just created a nice big section in the back there. That said, there are a lot of caveats to this. Things like each new child lot can only have one piece of middle housing on it. You have to have utilities for each individual unit. You have to have easements in place for things like utilities, shared driveways, common areas, etc. And so really the crux of it is that generally speaking, for the parent lot, you have to meet all the applicable development standards, setbacks, and everything else. And the middle housing land division is a tool that the state has introduced to essentially allow and increase homeownership of actual individual units. And so they've done this through a couple different ways. And so what you'll actually see in the draft code amendments is a significant amount of changes to the procedures section, the application policy section that come in the back end of the code. So we're talking about the 9.7 thousands and the 9.8 thousands. And that's because what middle housing land division did is it called upon what's called an expedited review or an expedited land division process. This is something that has existed in state code for a long time. It's on all of our applications. You could use it if you want to. Nobody has because it's not actually that expedited, but it's existed in state law, and middle housing land divisions essentially said, hey, let's use that process and create a more streamlined thing because they want to make this process as easy and simple as possible. So we codified that expedited process. So we essentially are taking state law requirements and we incorporated them into our own. So it's easier for people to navigate our local processes, because I think one of the barriers to the expedited process was the fact that it existed up here in state statute as opposed to locally. So knowing that, people can call upon the expedited review process, which is now codified here. They can go through the middle housing land division. And like I said, we're creating you have a parent lot and you're creating multifamily middle housing child lots. There's some basic standards to these, such as 1 unit per lot. You have to meet all the applicable development standards for the parent lot. You have to meet the lot standards for the parent lot. You do have to meet frontage improvements. You have to go through if there's right of way required, you might have to dedicate it. There's easements requirements. So for utilities, pedestrian access to the street, common areas, shared driveways or parkings, separate utilities, and you do it to comply with the building code. And so the lot standards and things like that, like I said, you have to meet the width and stuff for the parent lot, but the middle housing baby lots, child lots, they only have to, they don't have a minimum lot area. They don't have a width. You're really, as long as they contain 1 unit of middle housing, you can create it that way. After you go, or kind of to finalize the middle housing process, we did call upon a few additional things, such as that the state allows us to do, which is you can't further subdivide or partition these new lots. So you're creating a new middle housing lot, but you're not increasing your development potential. That unit on a child lot, so in this example here, this unit, triplex unit 2, even though you put it on its own lot, it's still 1 unit in triplex, regardless if it's a detached triplex unit or an attached triplex unit. It remains 1 unit. It doesn't get an ADU because ADUs are only applicable to single unit dwellings. It can't subdivide further. So there's those qualifications. And then finally, we also did allow or require that there's a notice of middle housing land division recording document. So essentially when somebody goes through a title report or something like that, when they're going to buy this 1 unit of a middle housing component, they know that, oh, I'm buying into 1 unit that's part of a fourplex. And we thought that was really important based on the fact that we're allowing detached plexes. So theoretically, somebody could create a fourplex of 4 detached structures, right? And it's going to appear to look like 4 little houses. So they think that they're just buying a lot and they can put an ADU on it. But we wanted to make sure that this notice of recorded middle housing land division is basically raises a flag that says, by the way, there's other caveats and restrictions that do apply to you. So that's why we required that. And so I'm happy to go into more detail. I know you guys have received presentations on this before. So this is really kind of a general overview. And so I'll open it up to questions, and I see that Commissioner Taylor has one. You're muted, Commissioner Taylor.
Sorry, thanks. In terms of, can you go back to the other slide? So I just want to make sure I am understanding. And right now I was looking through the actual, I wanted to see the actual code language, but you're saying that the standards apply as bulleted here generally apply both to the parent lot and the middle housing lot. Is that correct?
I'll clarify that. So here, I've got a good slide for that actually. Yeah, I might have lost it. So this is a good slide that represents this well. So here you've got a fourplex, right? And they want to, so you've got 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit, and they want to create these 4 lots. So you've got kind of 1 lot, 2 lot, 3 lot, 4 lot. There's no, for the middle housing lots, you do not have frontage requirement. You do not have a width requirement. You do not have a lot area requirement. I think those are the main ones. So those standards that would apply to the parent lot, those matter. The parent lot still has to meet our traditional normal standards. The middle housing lots themselves do not have those additional limitations. You can kind of create those wherever, a middle housing lot, wherever on a lot and however big.
So if I summarized, this is a good diagram, and this is really where I wanted clarity. Really the only thing, if someone was to come in and do this, that they would need to pay attention to if they think of any possibility in the future of creating these child lots, is really separate utilities to each of the units. Is that really it? The rest can be kind of embedded within easements.
That's generally pretty correct. And one thing I do want to call attention to, and that's a really important thing to think about. It's not really within the confines of the land use code, but utilities have to be separated by certain distances. So people will have to think about that when they come in to develop or go through the middle housing land division process. But when you go through this process, you could do the middle housing land division after you develop, or you could do it before you develop, or you could do it while you develop. So there's really no limitation on when you go through this process. But let's say you decide to do a middle housing land division before you develop, whatever you end up building. So somebody could create these child lots and those exist on the land. And if they decide not to build, the next person will come and have to match that design unless they go through a whole nother middle housing land division process to essentially re-wipe the map and clean it off. And then the other thing that I missed, and something that I think is really important, is that we also proposed and got direction on not only applying this to middle housing that complies with HB 2001 and the state law, we also said we should apply this to existing middle housing. So because we have duplex division standards already, we already allow this for duplexes. It didn't really make sense to us not to expand that opportunity to create middle housing lots for existing development. So basically the way that it's written, we'll have to update it based on the date that the actual code passes, but we wrote that if you developed your middle housing prior to this date and you complied with the standards at that time, you could also go through this process. We don't want to limit to just new development. And so, yeah. Any other questions at this time, Commissioner Taylor, before I hand it over to Chair?
Yeah, I have one other follow-up item. I just want to make sure it's a little outside so we can revisit it when we get there if you think applicable or if you want to answer now. I just want to make sure I heard you say this, that in fact, you don't have to wait for one process to complete before the next starts. You can actually do them simultaneously. They can either be concurrent, they can be staggered. Because obviously time, additional application costs money, yet there could be an option where you want it separate and discrete. So there's a whole bunch of options, and essentially the code doesn't inhibit what those options are at this point.
I see Lauren has her hand raised, so I'll let her respond to that.
I would say yes, and in addition to what Jeff mentioned, which is the availability of the middle housing land division prior to development, at the same time as development, following development. Version 2 of the code includes a staff proposed change that would allow a middle housing land division to run concurrently with a traditional subdivision or partition application. So if you have, a larger subdivision and you want some of those lots to also have middle housing land divisions associated with them, that can run concurrently as well.
Great. That was going to be my follow-up one. Definitely support that. That's great.
With that, I'll go to Chair Beeson.
So this might be kind of minor. I'm looking back at page, should have had this, page 36 in the draft code. It's middle housing, you know where I am now. It's middle housing lot standards, 9.2777. Pretty much all that remains of it after the edits are 3 points. And as I've read them, in reading them initially, and each time through, I found myself thinking about this whole thing about middle housing lot divisions and feeling like there's some inconsistency here. So, I mean, when I look at your figure that you're using to talk about middle housing land divisions, you're starting out with a middle housing lot, a single lot, developing a quad, subdividing it into 4 child lots from the parent lot. And I'm just having trouble when I read what's on page 36. It feels like there are some inconsistencies there and maybe some editing needed. Let me leave it there.
Clarification. I can see where the confusion stems from. However, middle housing lot is a defined term, and a middle housing lot is the thing that results from the middle housing land division. So it's the child lot. So the child lot / middle housing lot doesn't really have any standards associated with it other than there has to be 1 unit of middle housing on it, et cetera. The parent lot is not called a middle housing lot. It is, although it is a lot that has middle housing on it, the defined term middle housing lot means the child lot. And so that's what with the child lot.
I'm okay with that. If that's, I'm just, it feels like this occurs quite a bit earlier in the code. And what you're saying makes perfect sense. So as I understand you, these 3 points that occur on this page really apply to the child lot.
That's correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Just to make sure I'm following along correctly. So if there was one lot that was not going to be middle housing, could the other lots that are comprised and be dividable if those lots wanted to become middle housing and still leaving one that isn't? So could the parent be not middle housing, but the child be middle housing?
So that's an interesting question. So let's use this example that I have in front of you for the three lots. So if triplex unit number 1 was actually a single family home that's existing on the lot, and you wanted to build 2 detached, or you wanted to like 2 detached to create a triplex on the lot, that single family home converts into a type of middle housing. So you would never be able to have just a not middle housing lot exist within the middle housing land division. That would be, you would just partition off that other part of the property first. You would create a standard normal lot. You would create just a normal lot for the single family unit. And then you would create a parent lot that then could house the middle housing on it.
I guess what I'm asking is, let's continue to use that analogy. So let's say lot 1 is your single family home, but does not have the design standards or the other standards that allow us to meet middle housing, but lots 2 and 3 do. So would that person then be barred from doing it because lot 1 could not become a middle housing lot, and thus we're taking 2 out of the rotation because of the problems with lot 1?
No, you'd be okay because the applicability for when the middle housing design standards apply, you get an out if you're not affecting that single family home at all. It can still be converted into a triplex. It just doesn't have to meet the standards as long as you're not also changing it or altering it in any way.
Got it. Thank you.
That's a pretty nuanced situation, but I'm pretty sure that's exactly how that would operate. It would come down to the applicability of the middle housing standards. So, Chair Beeson, do you still have your hand raised? Do you have another question? All right. Are there any other questions on middle housing land divisions at this time, or the processes that govern it? All right, I will continue on then. I guess I will offer an opportunity here. I know I'll ask the Commission for the general support of the middle housing land division process and processes as stated in the draft code. We're not recommending any changes here. We just wanted to provide an opportunity for questions, comments, and deliberation. So is there general support for our middle housing land division procedures and standards? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so I'm going to get into other code items. I'm going to start with a presentation on other code items that staff have identified, specifically residential standards and some updates to our figures, just as a reference point. And then this is a good time for other code items of interest that are brought forward by the planning commissioners. Now, the first thing that I'm going to talk about, the residential zone standards, this came up with item number 7, which we presented to you back on November 30th. And it was the one thing that we said, staff, go back, take a look at the best way to kind of solve the confusion and lack of clarity that existed within the lot standards. And just for reference, that was this slide, and it was this issue that we created around, what is a lot for the development of duplexes and triplexes. There was just this lack of clarity and confusion around this. So staff, we've gone back and we took a look at kind of how this section could work for residential standards regarding middle housing. And so I do want to touch base at a high level, thinking about how we regulate things within the residential section of our land use code. We've got kind of 3 main sections, and you can think of that as uses, development standards, and lot standards. And so uses are basically, what can I do in my lot? Standards are saying, if you can do it on that lot, how can you do it? And then lot standards are saying, I'm going to be creating a lot and it has to meet these standards, or I'm going to be changing my lot and it needs to meet these standards. And so there's kind of those 3 sections. And so I provided to you really close to the start of this meeting an updated version of what this could look like, but I'm going to walk us through that really quick, just to kind of show you what these changes would look like to achieve kind of some clarity. So one of the biggest pieces of confusion was lot standards and the fact that we have these things called, we had references to things called duplex lots, triplex lots, fourplex lots, and cottage cluster lots, but they weren't defined. And so we took this opportunity to just create really simple definitions that says a lot of parcel that meets the minimum lot area required for the development of blank. So if it's a duplex lot, it's for the development of a duplex. If it's triplex lot, it's for it has the right lot area to match with what the Planning Commission has said the lot area for a duplex is. So a good example of this is you want duplexes to be allowed on lots that are 2,250 square feet. Therefore, a duplex lot must have at least 2,250 square feet. So we aligned to those things and created a clear set of definitions for them. The other change that we saw is that we proposed for clarity, and I apologize for scrolling while I'm sharing my screen. I know that's a faux pas, but under the uses, so thinking about those three categories, right? Uses, development standards, and lot standards. Under uses, we moved the lot standards because if you look at the way that when we think about uses, it's basically, is it permitted? is it permitted with special standards or is it not permitted? That's kind of how we look at things. And so based on the way things were written, we wanted to make it very clear based on the use table and the uses that we match what the commission has agreed to. So we moved this section into the uses category. It was previously down under density, but it didn't, we don't believe it functioned correctly in that area. And we actually think it was more appropriate to move it up to the uses area, because it basically now says that in accordance with state law and what the planning commission and potentially what might eventually be codified, middle housing is permitted on the following lots. So it's using that word permitted, right? So we're looking at the actual use. And that's, so this is where we have duplexes must be on lots that are 2,250 square feet, triplexes on 3,500, 4,500. So this is not new language that you're seeing here. This is just language that's been shifted up from the development standards for some clarity. So with that, the only things that remain under the development standards regarding this, because obviously in the development standards, the most important thing is that we're saying the maximum density doesn't apply, right? So we don't want maximum density to apply to duplexes, triplexes, and the other types of middle housing, because we're governing those differently. We are governing townhomes and cottage clusters through density. So because that's not a whole question of use, we kept that under the density section in the development standards. So you'll see that those standards still remain. So cottage clusters in R1 shall have a minimum density of 4 units an acre. And the same for townhomes, and the density increases that you get for those development standards. So those still remain. We think that's, while we've changed the order, we believe that this is actually going to function in a more cohesive way that works better with the way that our land use code functions. So finally, so all this was precipitated by you saying that's a little confusing in this section. Now that we've defined a duplex lot and we've defined triplex lots, fourplex lots, cottage cluster lots, we just have those square footages associated with those, so it's very clear what those are, what that square footage is. And we tied that into standards for lots that are consistent with the exact same thing that was mentioned in the use table up above. Basically saying that a duplex may be developed on any lot or parcel with 2,250 square feet, or any lot or parcel at a single unit dwelling would be attached. So that is what and why staff changed things the way that we did. I understand that these are a lot of changes, and this is the first time that you're having really a full opportunity to consider them. I'll open it up for questions, and then we can see how we feel about actually taking action on this. So I'll open it up for questions. By action, I mean a poll. Any questions? I know that was a lot. So Commissioner Fragala.
I just want to commend staff on their work in this area, because I do feel it's a lot clearer. I'm not a user of the code, but it does seem like it's articulated in a variety of locations, depending on how somebody might approach the use of the code. So I really appreciate the changes, and supported the original content, but definitely support the changes that I'm seeing here. And thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragala. And I'll preface this with, if we can take a poll today to support these changes, and we can incorporate them into the code. And then you would have a chance to bring that up at our next deliberations meeting as well, if you have any follow-up questions to what that looks like. So are there any other follow-up questions at this time? All right, I'll take a poll, which is basically, do you support the amendments that staff proposed to those subsections that were presented to you, and Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen at the same time I'm taking a poll. That's a bad idea. Sorry, let me start that over. Do you support the amendments as staff has proposed to subsections that were presented here for residential standards? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. We will incorporate that into the code, and you'll see that in the final draft. And you can follow up with any questions on that as well. So I will resume and just resume, I promise. So lastly, I just want to let you know, this was something that was noted in version 2, that we had a couple updates to our figures coming. We were just waiting for those to be done, or for those to be articulated by me to the designers in a cohesive way. And so our window facade figure, which is this one, we just wanted to make it really clear. Before it was a little unclear, so we made sure that all this area is facade, it's shown in gray, and we have some clarity on what qualifies as window coverage to meet the standards for window coverage for quadplexes, triplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters. So that's just a fix that we felt made things more clear for users. Additionally, we did change the diagram or the figure for cottage clusters to include some clarifying commentary on what the common courtyard actually constitutes, and some changes to the actual letters that are on the document, which I think I snagged the wrong version for this visual that I'm showing you here, but those will be incorporated into the final version of the draft code, consistent with version 2, which we mentioned. So, Commissioner Taylor.
Sorry, I just want to bring up that particular item, one of the ones we were going to talk about. So, yeah.
Great. So with that, those are the staff other code items. So I'll open it up to commissioners for any code items that they wanted to discuss today. Commissioner Taylor.
You know, I'm not sure we want to dive into it today, but I did notice that you didn't, unless that's not for tonight, and you've intentionally left it, is adjustment reviews. This
would be the time to bring that up. The other code section was the time to talk about anything of that sort of nature. So if you have some specific questions, comments, or recommendations, be happy to field those. So, I can share that as well if that's helpful.
Yeah, I actually don't know if we need to, because like I said, I mean, the commissioners all know that I met with Lauren and Jeff and kind of talked about a lot of my comments that reflect public testimony, et cetera, in my document. And I did have some thorough questions in adjustment review. I'm not sure I need to bring it up, so maybe the better time, because it was a good discussion. You were going to take it away and have suggestions. So should I just wait for the final draft? That's fine also.
There'll be an opportunity to comment on these things at the final draft, and it might be better for you to be able to see your code recommendations in C2, because those are, I wouldn't say they were mostly clarifications to make things more clear. And we didn't feel that they were substantive to the point where they needed to be presented as changes such as these. So why don't I agree with you that we can wait at this time, and then we can discuss it if there's need to at our next deliberations meeting. Are there any other code items of any kind that staff has not brought up during this process, knowing that our last couple items today are the Metro Plan Amendment and affordability strategies? Commissioner Fragala. Did I just nail it? All right, well, with that, I'm going to jump into and allow commissioners to, again, this is another one of those items where you agreed to this change previously through a straw poll, but we want to make sure that you have adequate time and opportunity to deliberate on this topic specifically. So as agreed to on November 30th, this is the change that's currently being made to or being added to policy A9 in the Metro Plan, which essentially carves out an exception to the maximum density for the low, medium, and high density ranges for middle housing types. So I'll provide an opportunity here for anybody to bring up any questions, comments, or deliberations on this. Seeing none, I'll move on at this time. Your previous poll indicated that you supported this change, so that's pretty clear. All right, so getting to affordability, and you'll notice that I've started making my A's very big so that you can see which type of affordability we're talking about. So we're talking about here what's currently in the code. So one thing I don't want to glance over is the fact that there is already a lot that is tackling lowercase, the overall cost to develop housing that you've included and recommended and staff has put into the code. And that includes things like allowing for the development on way more places throughout Eugene, consistent with state law, but you've gone further and allowed it on more and smaller lots. So you're getting just a higher amount of middle housing, which reduces land cost because the more land is the more expensive. So that's just one way. You promote smaller middle housing unit sizes. So we talked about those incentives last time. You've created a couple different incentives to establish units that are 900 square feet or smaller, which would be more cost effective. And then additionally, you've gone through in quite a number of spaces and reduced the overall design standards from what the model code set forth and eliminated some of those to make middle housing development easier and therefore more cost, reducing some of that cost because the more design standards is typically associated with a higher cost. So at our previous meetings, we talked about ways to move beyond the lowercase affordability, because we know at this point, really some of the only things left to us to affect lowercase affordability or the actual cost of housing is just removing design standards, which we've already kind of covered today. So we did want to bring to you an option for capital A affordable. So capital A affordable, in this specific example, we're looking at income qualified incentives. So basically, we would build in some incentives around people who are providing housing units to low income people. So people who meet a certain income threshold below the median income. I have an example here of how this could be used. And I have some policy questions for the commission generally that I'll get to in a second. But in the example, I say lot area reduction for affordable units. So in the same way that if you create a duplex with units that are under 900 square feet, you get a lot reduction of 25%. So you can essentially create higher density housing through doing that. In the same way, we would offer that to people who are providing affordable units of housing. So you might not have to create something that's 900 square feet. You get the same reduction if you're creating affordable capital A housing. So here, in this example, I basically provided that a triplex with 100% affordable units would be allowed on a lot with an area of 2,625 square feet, as opposed to the typical 3,500 square feet that's required. And so that's how that could work. Where some of the policy questions come in is, do we, when we're thinking about applying some of these incentives, do you want one unit in a triplex to be affordable? Do all units in the triplex have to be affordable? Do at least 50% have to be affordable? The other question is, what is low income? So in this example here, I've provided that it's 80% of the area median income or lower would qualify for this, as long as they're renting to people or providing that housing to people of that income qualification. And then the other one is, where do we apply this incentive? So we've found kind of 3 locations that we've applied this incentive for parking reductions, allowing middle housing on even smaller lots than they would be normally, and then allowing lots to be created that are smaller than would normally be allowed if you're doing income qualification. So first, I think I'll open it up to, is there any question about the actual, what this incentive is or how it would operate before we get into the actual policy conversation around land? So are there any questions there? All right. See, Commissioner Taylor.
Sorry, Jeff, can you give me some context, just because I know staff is thoughtful. like why staff went with 100% rather than 50%, for instance, that actually maybe encouraged, I like the idea. I mean, 100%, you might not get what you want. So I'm just curious where the 100% and 80%.
I set those there. That was me intentionally to prompt the question.
Got it.
So this is entirely a realm of, it is a policy discussion where staff could make a recommendation, but really is looking for planning commission guidance on where to, because we haven't drafted any of these standards yet. So we're going to be taking away the information we get from you today, drafting these drafting the language so that then you can see what that would look like and get more information on if you want to change those things.
So is there any way that you could share some information from the community development section that addresses affordable housing, because what they see in terms of effective incentives and where that would lie ideally? Because like I don't like, as you know, arbitrary. So I'm inclined to do it less than 100% just because I would like more of it. And I think by hybridizing, we can get, 50% kind of allows for it to pencil, and then 50% can be affordable capital A. But once again, I don't like arbitrary, and I know you've got staff that are kind of keeping very current on kind of the realities of the development around affordable housing.
I see that Terry put her camera on. I just wanted to see if she wanted to respond to this one. I know she has a lot of context on the affordability conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for the question, Kristen. Yeah, there's a ton of public interest in this. We've received a lot of public testimony. You've talked about it a lot. And we're still working to understand from our housing staff, who are very stretched thin right now, what would be the best way to manage this sort of incentive. So given the discussion today, that's one of our next steps, is to take that back to the housing team, ask for their input, and then return to you with something a little bit more polished. The other thing I would say about this is that, as I mentioned earlier, we have another track going that would look at a density bonus from a 4-plex to a 6-plex. And that is on a track of being looked at for economic feasibility and then vetted with developers as well. So we can bring you an update on that in January as well. But that one would be implemented through the housing implementation pipeline process, whereas this one could be incorporated into the code amendments that we're working on right now.
Thanks, Terry. Commissioner Fragola.
So thank you very much for this. I feel like it is a really good response to the large amount of public input and feedback we've heard about absolutely optimizing the code as much as we can to promote capital A affordable housing, even though, we know the code strategy is limited in some ways. So I'm excited to see it being managed as part of the code adoption strategy, as well as the fact that it's going to be tackled as part of the HIP. I wanted to be clear that this would apply to all middle housing types. And then I was looking back quickly to our definitions, and I guess I had thought we had some definitions around what constituted. Okay, so we have subsidized low income, but we don't have a specific definition of low income. And so I am wondering, depending on, do we have any guidelines around that definition? And would we need to incorporate a definition?
I see Lauren has raised her hand, so I always give her the benefit to go first.
So Commissioner Fraggle, a great question. I think I can answer that in part, and part of it is a policy question for the commission. So we do have a controlled income and rent density bonus now that doesn't apply to middle housing, and we investigated whether we could just sort of map it onto middle housing, and there were some difficulties with doing that. So we've kind of pivoted to this proposal instead. The controlled income and rent, Terry and Jeff, you can help me remember, I believe is triggered for housing available to folks making 60% of the area median income or below. Is that?
It's this one. This is where I started here. So
okay.
It's
80%. Much of the federally subsidized housing and housing rent that receives state subsidies sits at 60% AMI. So, and then I believe that in, other presentations, this is something that we can certainly circle back with community development folks on. I mean, we've identified a need for, through the HIP, they've identified a need for housing at all income levels throughout the city. And I believe that staff have also sort of honed in on a need for housing at that kind of between 60% and 100% of area median income. So to some extent, it's really up to the policymakers to say, if you want to provide this kind of affordability option, what you define as affordable, capital A, affordable for this purpose. And it could be 60. There's certainly precedent for that. It could be 80. There's certainly precedent for that. I think you could probably even go higher. So that's some feedback that we're looking for from Planning Commission.
And then I was correct, it applies to all middle housing types.
Correct. In this example, it excludes townhouses, but we would also create this type of incentive for townhouses and their density bonus that they receive.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, the way that I see your example says at or below 80%. So that would be capping it at 80%, which would, and I did find the definition, and it does say at or below 80%. So that would be consistent with current practice, but certainly would encompass that lower range, which would be the 60 to 80 as well. So, so I am supportive of that, and I'm really excited to see how we can move this forward in a way that has the greatest impact.
Thanks, Commissioner Fragala. I'll do a time check that we're getting pretty close to 8 o'clock, and so Commissioner Isaacson, I'll give you a chance to speak though.
Thanks. I just want to make sure, and I think I heard from Terry that the issues that would be surrounding, say, the C Street development in Springfield that Square One had put up is going to be something that's going to be tackled by the HIP. Is that correct?
I think it depends which aspect you're talking about. I was talking about a density bonus up to a sixplex plus financial incentives, which would be tackled under the HIP.
Okay, so the question I have is that the city density standards, apparently there needs to be some language change, at least as far as I'm correct by the letter that I sent. Is that something that we need to tackle in some of the code questions we're bringing up now, or is that something that HIP is going to be discussing as well?
So I can jump in a little bit on that. So under the current proposal, you'd be able to do something similar to the C Street project, that as long as it qualified under one of the definitions of middle housing. So you could have 4 units, whereas the C Street project, I believe, had 6 or 8. I can't recall exactly how many, but so those, if you went beyond that into the 6 or 8 plex range, that would be the one that would have to be implemented through the HIP. We're keeping this within the bounds of the definitions of middle housing. In regards to how many units we're talking about. So I think that a lot of the flexibility that's applied to middle housing, you'd be able to do projects like that, but you wouldn't be able to get to the number of units at this time under this code proposal.
Right, that's what I was asking, because because the middle home housing code amendments only offer an exception for city density standards, we'd have to add additional language that would allow it. So is that something that we are looking at potentially doing through middle housing, or is it going to only be something that we're going to be looking through HIP?
It's not something that staff recommends doing during this process, and there's several reasons associated with that, but one of the primary reasons is associated with the fact that there's very explicit standards in the rules from the state that basically say we can assume certain levels of density in regards to, say, our goal 10 findings or our transportation findings, that we, as long as the code amendments are specific to middle housing, then we can rely on those. If we started entering into the conversation of sixplexes and eightplexes, we would have to go do additional research and work to demonstrate compliance with the statewide planning goals, which we don't think is within the scope or time allowance for this project. I'm just being completely honest about it.
I would agree with that explanation, and maybe just suggest, since we're at a minute past time, that a possible straw poll on this could be to direct staff to go get input from our housing staff on these questions and bring back a recommendation.
Can I get hands on that straw poll? Perfect. We staff will do that. And Terry, that's actually the end of my slides today. So I'm at our planning commission still at how much you're working.
Wow. I'm astounded how you guys have been churning through so many technical, complex items in these meetings. Like, give yourselves a hand. This is really, really, really
How
great
many
work.
years have we been talking about this?
And to finish basically on time. I mean, that's impressive, you know.
I just give huge kudos to staff. I mean, honestly, it's the staff and the public process. I mean, it's really,
really good. Yeah. Thank you. So I don't think we have really anything else. You have a break until your meeting on January 11th. So have some time to relax. We wish you all a happy new year, and we would see you back in the new year unless you have anything else. Jeff, Lauren?
Happy holidays, you all.
Happy holidays, everybody. Happy Merry everything.
All right.
Yeah, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting, and we'll see everybody back here on January 11th.
Perfect.